Well now, hello dear adventurers. Welcome back to a new evening of tales and adventures. Today, we leave behind the shadows of great battles, and we travel to a quiet corner of Middle-earth, where life moves at a slower pace among the green hills and warm homes. Today, we'll come to know the story of the Shire, homeland of the Hobbits. Hobbits are a peaceful folk, fond of comfort, who love good food and stories told beside the warmth of a hearth. But their origins are shrouded in mystery. Where did they come from? How did they find the paradise that became their home? And how did they end up, without ever meaning to, playing a pivotal role in the events that shaped Middle-earth's history? On this journey, we'll explore their beginnings, the founding of the Shire, and the challenges its people faced over the centuries. And if you love these stories and wish to support the channel, don't forget to subscribe. Now just imagine you're sitting outside a hobbit hole door, breathing in the smell of fresh bread on the air, and listening to ancient tales from forgotten times. Let's begin this journey and discover the legacy of the Hobbits. The story of the Hobbits begins farther back than many suppose, in deep, distant times, long before their little villages were built on the hills of the Shire. The origin of this unique race, humble and peculiar in nature, goes back to a remote past, full of secrets and old legends never fully revealed. Hobbits, also known as halflings, or the little folk, weren't always as we see them today. A friendly-looking people, with warm homes in green hills, growing their food and enjoying life's simple pleasures. In their early days, they were a more wandering people, made up of small groups living in the valleys, forests, and plains throughout Middle-earth, far from the great kingdoms of elves, men, and dwarfs. The earliest hobbits were known as the Little Men, a branch of humankind, but with distinct traits: short stature, thick hair on their feet, and a clear inclination toward a simple, quiet life. In truth, they were a unique folk, their roots intertwined with the other ancient races of Middle-earth. Though they were often just looked upon as small humans, their origin was more complex than it seemed, tied to the idea of a people who, from their first days, sought a secluded life, away from the great conflicts and battles that decided the fate of the other races. The first hints of hobbits, though vague, appear in the oldest records, where it's said they are descended from the first humans who appeared in Middle-earth, when the Valar still ruled the world. These humans, among the most modest and simple of Iluvatar's children, had a peaceful nature, inclined to protect life, home, and stability. And unlike the great heroes in the stories of men, like Isildur or Aragorn, hobbits were always a race that avoided involvement in Middle-earth's great events, preferring to live on the edge of conflicts and wars. They moved away from the rest of humankind, searching for a place of greater safety and quiet, and migrated to remote, isolated regions. They found their refuge in the lands of the Anduin Valley, in the south of Middle-earth, where they could finally live in peace and out of sight of other peoples. And as time passed, the hobbits developed a deep relationship with the nature around them. They learned to live simply, building their homes in caves or burrowing tunnels into hills, a habit that became their defining architectural trait, offering them protection and a hidden life away from the outside world. And as the ages rolled on, the hobbits spread and drifted apart, eventually dividing into 3 chief families: the Harfoots, the stocky and hardy ones, the Stores, the river folk, and the Fallowhides, the fairer and bolder ones. Each group adapted to different regions of Middle-earth, but they all shared a common desire for seclusion, safety, and stability. The Harfoots were the first to settle permanently, finding their refuge in the hills and forests. They were the most reclusive of the groups, the most adapted to life underground, and they would become the most common kind of hobbit. Their homes, to this day, are burrowed into hillsides, little holes that offered them protection from the whims of weather and any outside threat. The Harfoots were known for their great skill in working the land and their cleverness in farming. They truly laid the foundation for the peaceful, prosperous life that would later become the enduring legacy of the hobbits. The Stores, the river folk, were more connected to water and streams. They lived in low, damp places, near lakes and great rivers like the Anduin. Unlike the Harfoots, the Stores were sturdier in build and a bit more hardy. They were the first among hobbits to develop some of their more advanced skills, like the use of boats and nets for fishing. These were talents passed down through generations, which would later influence even the hobbits of the Shire. The Fallowhides, the fair and tall ones, were the most adventurous of the 3 groups. They preferred living in the uplands and remote places, like the highlands of Eriador. They were known for their boldness, their skill in hunting, and a nature more open to exploration and interaction with the other peoples of Middle-earth. While most hobbits were reserved and isolated by nature, the Fallowhides were more willing to have contact with elves and other folk from the lofty and mysterious parts of the world. Despite the differences between these 3 peoples, what united all hobbits was a deep love for peace, comfort, and steadiness. They were not, and never would be, warriors or conquerors. Their strength lay not in swords, but in quiet patience, in the ability to endure without drawing attention, and in their skill at building a simple life, rich with satisfaction, far from the great power struggles. They were the guardians of daily life, the keepers of quiet, the preservers of the small details that create the true meaning of home and family. For long centuries, the hobbits lived in almost complete isolation, while the outside world churned with wars, alliances, and the constant strife between the forces of good and evil. The elves and men, preoccupied with the grand fate of Middle-earth, often didn't even notice the hobbits, or simply didn't acknowledge them. And for the hobbits themselves, that was precisely what they wanted: to live outside the influence of great power, away from the plots and conflicts that made the history of other peoples. It was only with the passage of time and with the rise of events that would forever change the face of Middle-earth that the hobbits found themselves drawn into a story far larger than themselves. And it all started in a small, quiet village among the hills of a place they came to call the Shire, a name that, on the surface, seemed to belong to just a simple settlement, but which would ultimately become the very heart of a great adventure that saved the fate of all Middle-earth. But that is a tale for another time. For now, all we know is that the origin of the hobbits is rooted in the search for simplicity, peace, and harmony with nature. a legacy they still honor to this day, in their little homes, their quiet villages, and in the great adventures they never sought, but which sought them out. The Shire, as many know it, is the land where the hobbits truly flourished and built their quiet homes, far from the tumults of great wars and the struggles of mighty powers. But to understand the Shire as we know it today, we have to journey back in time to explore how it came to be, how the hobbits founded this peaceful haven, and how it transformed into one of the most symbolic places in the history of Middle-earth. Well, now, our story truly begins around the year 1600 of the Third Age, when a historic event changed the fate of the hobbits forever. By that time, hobbits had already settled in various parts of central Middle-earth, but they were scattered, without real unity or a clear collective identity. They lived in small settlements near the river Anduin, in the hills of Bree, and in other remote and often more dangerous places like the marshy lands. Their lives were simple, but this dispersion made it hard to form a cohesive community. It was in this context, under the leadership of a far-sighted hobbit named Marco and his brother Blanco, that the hobbits began to organize and unite, forming the first kernel of what would later be known as the Shire. Marco belonged to one of the influential families among the hobbit folk, and he was the first to gather the scattered families and groups to establish a new land, a safe haven where they could live in peace, far from the great powers of Middle-earth. This move was profoundly important. It represented the first real attempt to build an independent hobbit entity, a place where hobbits could thrive without getting tangled in the conflicts of the outside world. They chose the land of the Shire for its perfect geographical traits: fertile soil, rich earth, gentle hills, and enough natural resources for a quiet, productive life. The area was also strategically isolated, distant from major threats, which provided the hobbits with an ideal environment to farm their land, build their homes, and live without a constant fear of invasion or war. The River Brandywine wound around its eastern borders, providing water, natural protection, and making the land more secure from dangers coming from the north and the east. In its beginnings, the Shire was simple in appearance, but rich in community spirit and belonging. As the years passed, the number of hobbits grew, and many families put down roots. Families like the Bagginses, the Tooks, the Cottons, the Chubbs, the Brandybucks, and others spread through the villages and towns, gradually transforming the Shire into a complete, integrated society. Yet life in the Shire was not without its challenges. Despite its isolation, the danger of outside interference always lingered. And for this reason, from its very founding, the hobbits began to think about protecting their land and their way of life. They were not a warlike people, nor seekers of adventure or strife. By nature, they were inclined toward farming, building families, and living peacefully apart from the outer world. Over the centuries, the Shire became more and more prosperous. Its villages thrived, its families multiplied, and the feeling of belonging to the Shire became a fundamental part of every hobbit's identity. A whole culture formed, built on quiet living, simple community, folk celebrations, traditional food, and deeply rooted customs. The hobbits began to take pride in their history, their land, and their traditions. The Shire became, in its essence, the embodiment of all these things, a homeland of peace, a house of simplicity, the eternal refuge of the hobbits. Still, the Shire was never completely beyond the reach of threats from the outside world. Even with their peaceful nature and constant desire to avoid conflict, they could not ignore the larger challenges posed by the world around them. Yet, the Shire endured, protected by its own values and by the determination of its people to live apart from the great wars that devastated so many other parts of Middle-earth. And so, the Shire, founded on the pillars of peace, friendship, and hard work, transformed into the homeland we all know today as the home of the hobbits. A land filled with history and simple, yet deeply meaningful lives, where every field, every river, every hill carries stories of old families, echoes of past legends, and memories of a quiet life that has stood the test of time. The Shire, as we know it, is a place where the small details of life are cherished. The smell of fresh bread, warm conversation by the hearth, and living in harmony with nature. Its founding wasn't just about building a country. It was the birth of a cohesive community that would later become a crucial element in the great events that changed the fate of all Middle-earth. If there's one thing that defines Hobbit life in the Shire, it is their constant pursuit of simplicity and contentment. Here, the worries of the outside world seem distant. Daily life revolves around simple activities that are essential for maintaining community and its values. Hobbits are known for their deep connection to the earth, to nature, and to daily life itself. Unlike other races in Middle-earth, like the elves, who seek great adventures and battles of honor, or men, preoccupied with the fate of their kingdoms and power struggles, hobbits value daily routine, the joy of small details, and the peace born from hard work and living in harmony with others. Life in the Shire begins in the earliest hours of the morning, when the sun is still low on the horizon. A hobbit's day starts with a simple breakfast, usually consisting of fresh bread, butter, cheese, and of course, a good cup of tea or ale. Hobbits possess a genuine passion for simple, delicious food, and mealtimes are among the most important moments of their day. They have a custom of eating several meals, a hearty breakfast, then a solid lunch, and finally the traditional dinner, which is always a family affair where relatives and friends gather. Farming is one of the most important activities in the Shire. Caring for the land is almost an art form for hobbits. They tend to their plots with love and dedication, growing everything they need for their daily lives. The hills of the Shire are full of fertile fields, orchards, and lush gardens where vegetables, fruits, and colorful flowers that decorate their homes all grow. The land is the soul of the Hobbit, which is why farmers, gardeners, and harvesters hold a place of great respect and esteem among them. They farm the land not only to feed their own families, but to support their neighbors and the entire community. Alongside this, hobbits are famous for their great love of celebrations and gatherings. They never miss a chance to bring family and friends together for large festivals, where food, music, and dance are always present. One of the greatest traditions in the Shire is the celebration of Bilbo Baggins' birthday, carried out with all magnificence and joy. For a hobbit, any occasion is a reason to celebrate, and any ordinary day can be turned into a festival. Their festivals are truly renowned for their joy and human warmth. And though life in the Shire is quiet and filled with simple pleasures, hobbits also devote themselves to tending and protecting their homes. The majority of homes in the Shire are built into the hills in an architectural style that blends underground structures with traditional buildings. These homes are known as smiles. They are incredibly warm and provide a safe, comfortable environment for hobbit families. Their entrances are typically round, fostering a feeling of security and belonging. And inside, they are filled with simple, cozy furniture, with hearths kept lit at all times, creating an atmosphere that is warm and deeply beloved. Hobbits hold a great respect for nature and the animals that live in harmony with them. Many homes contain gardens and pens that shelter small animals like rabbits, chickens, and pigs. The hills and woods surrounding the Shire are home to wild creatures, and hobbits maintain a deeply respectful relationship with them. They are, at their heart, guardians of the natural balance of their land, able to connect with their environment in a unique and profound way. Another prominent feature of life in the Shire is a powerful sense of community and fellowship that fills all social interactions. While every hobbit has their own home and business, everyone knows each other and maintains relationships of mutual support. Neighbors help one another, whether with field work, building a home, or organizing a community celebration. There is a strong feeling of belonging and cooperation, which creates a safety net of friendship that makes life in the Shire all the more special and distinctive. Yet, despite their natural isolation and desire to preserve peace, the hobbits were never completely disconnected from the happenings in the rest of Middle-earth. They may not have participated in the great battles, but they were aware of the threats brewing. In the rare moments that disturbed the Shire's quiet routine, such as the occasional incursion by outsiders or the presence of enemies, the community would unite to protect their homeland. This protection was embodied in the legends of hobbit heroes who, though rare, would emerge from time to defend the Shire from great dangers. Thus, life in the Shire reflects everything the hobbits hold most dear: peace, simplicity, and connection to nature. They are a race that does not seek power or glory, but finds joy in the small things that give life its meaning. In the Shire, a sunny morning, a shared meal with friends, and laughter among the green fields are more valuable than any great victory. The year 1601 of the Third Age stands as a vital milestone in the history of the Hobbit Shire, marking its official founding, the first establishment of its borders, and its first formal recognition. In this way, the hobbits became a known and acknowledged society within Middle-earth. Though they had lived in the region for a long time, this founding was crucial for what the Shire would later become: a protected and isolated land where the hobbit folk could live in peace, far from the great wars and conflicts that entangled the other races. The story of the Shire's founding is tied to a significant event known as the Great Covenant, a pact made between the hobbits and King Elessar, the ruler of men, in the aftermath of the wars that had devastated Middle-earth. This covenant was the result of a shared desire to preserve the Shire and ensure its peace, far from the threats that still lingered in other parts of the world. During the 1600s of the Third Age, the realm of men was recovering its strength after the fall of Sauron. The Great Wars had ended, allowing for a period of healing and rebuilding. In this new landscape, the hobbits were seen as well protected, and the lands of the Shire were viewed as a safe haven. Though the hobbits themselves had no great interest in power or controlling lands, the formal founding of the Shire was a way to ensure their people could continue living in their simple, yet secure manner, free from outside influence. For the hobbits, this time was an opportunity to step away from the chaos and great conflicts that had swept through Middle-earth, and to settle in a quiet region where their traditions and customs could be maintained. The hobbit leaders of that period, such as Isengard Took, were the principal figures responsible for consolidating the Shire's official establishment. Isengard was a figure of great importance, a practical leader who understood his people's need for an organized structure and a system that would guarantee peace and well-being for all. And so, in the year 1601 of the Third Age, the Shire was formally recognized and its borders were drawn. Over time, the Shire came to be governed by a class of leaders who, without any show of pride or ambitions for power, made decisions for the good of the community as a whole. This period also saw new settlers arriving in the region, most of them hobbits coming from other parts of Middle-earth in search of a quieter life. The area gradually became more populated as families settled into the hills and along the rivers and green fields. The lands surrounding the Shire were fertile, and farming flourished, leading to an economy based on simple trade and food cultivation, which brought further stability to the region. An important aspect of this founding was the creation of a simple, modest hobbit government, responsible for local decision-making and resolving disputes. The Shire, by its nature, is a place that values community life, and its leaders were sometimes viewed with a bit of healthy skepticism. Politics were straightforward, often limited to choosing respected members of the community to handle practical, everyday matters. During the Shire's establishment, the major hobbit families, like the Bagginses, the Tooks, and the Brandybucks, played vital roles, with each family establishing areas where their activities were centered and their local community was organized. Hobbit homes were built in a simple yet effective manner. Many of them delved directly into the hillsides, creating a warm and secure environment. This practice of building underground made the Shire unique, with interconnected tunnels and rooms forming communities that felt closer and more intimate. The borders of the Shire were defined by the surrounding hills, with deep valleys and forests providing natural protection against any potential threat. Soon enough, the hills of Hobbiton, one of the most famous villages in the Shire, became a symbol of the quiet and tranquility this land represents. These small villages, scattered throughout the region, were places where the hobbit folk could live out their days without being preoccupied with the greater affairs of the outside world. Alongside farming and family life, the cultural life of the Shire flourished during this period. The tales, songs, and legends passed down from generation to generation helped solidify the hobbit identity. Food played a central role in celebrations, with simple, delicious dishes like honey cakes, pumpkin pudding, and homebrewed ale, as they often gathered for festivals and feasts. These occasions became the backbone of social life, where everyone could share their stories, their joys, and their sorrows. However, it's important to emphasize that even with this apparent calm and stability, the Shire was not completely shielded from external challenges. Its founding did not mean it was wholly isolated from the rest of Middle-earth. Despite the protection of its hills and forests, its growing population and prosperity eventually began to attract outside attention. In the distant future, this safety would be disturbed. But the founding in the year 1601 of the Third Age guaranteed the hobbits a secure land where they could thrive, far from the great power struggles and the shadows of large-scale wars. Then, in the year 1636 of the Third Age, the Shire, which until then had been a place protected from the great calamities that struck other parts of Middle-earth, faced an unexpected crisis. This crisis took the shape of a deadly pandemic known as the Great Plague. Like other pestilences that had swept through the history of Middle-earth, damaging the civilizations of elves, men, and dwarves alike, the Great Plague appeared from an unknown source. It spread like wildfire, swiftly devastating the villages and fields of the Shire. The plague emerged suddenly, striking the hobbit folk without mercy. The Shire was an isolated place, far from the main trade routes and the wars of distant lands. For centuries, the hobbits had lived believing their tranquility was unshakable. Their greatest fears were poor harvests or autumn storms. But the Great Plague showed them a reality they had never before faced: vulnerability. The illness afflicted hobbits in a completely unpredictable manner, with no clear pattern determining who would fall sick. At first, there were isolated cases in remote villages, but soon the disease began to spread throughout the entire Shire. The symptoms seemed mild and harmless to untrained eyes: a slight fever, a cough, fatigue. But they rapidly grew worse. Hobbits who had seemed in excellent health began to suffer from raging fevers, their bodies weakening swiftly as the disease spread among them with devastating force. Death began to move through the villages. The hobbit families, known for their closeness and strong bonds, watched their loved ones, parents, children, grandparents, succumb to an illness for which there seemed to be no cure. Homes once filled with laughter and joy turned into places of grief and pain. There was no known treatment, and many of the traditional remedies the hobbits used, like medicinal herbs or home-brewed potions, were powerless against the destructive force of the plague. As the days passed, the villages and towns of the Shire began to empty of their people. Many hobbits, in an attempt to protect themselves, isolated themselves in their homes, fearing that contact with others would spread the disease further. The streets, once filled with laughter and celebration, fell silent. Homes were abandoned, leaving the most vulnerable behind. Yet even as death claimed so many lives, the Shire did not collapse entirely. Even in the face of this catastrophe, the spirit of the hobbit community remained strong. Instead of surrendering to despair, some of the more resilient families and villages banded together to care for the sick. The more remote villages, which had been less affected by the plague, began sending what aid they could to the hardest hit areas. Healthy hobbits carried food and what medicines they had, and though these efforts were not always enough, they were a testament to their enduring bonds. A strange, heavy quiet settled over the land. a feeling that the Shire's very nature had been uprooted. Fear spread among the hobbits, a feeling utterly foreign to a culture that had always prided itself on peace and safety. For the elders, this was a time of nightmares, something they never imagined they would live to see. Many of the old folk, the pillars of their communities, died swiftly, leaving the younger generations without their guidance and wisdom. The children were among the most deeply affected by the Great Plague. While the adults struggled to hold on to hope, the little ones, whose laughter and games usually filled the Shire, grew quiet, watching the suffering of the grown-ups without truly understanding what was happening. This left a profound mark on an entire generation of hobbits who grew up with memories entirely different from the childhoods of their parents. The loss was immense. Many of the most affected villages became known not for their glory and celebrations, but for the graves that accumulated in their fields and gardens. Every burial ground became a grim reminder of life's fragility. Many hobbits, once cheerful and secure, began to wonder if they were truly as safe as they had believed. But the Shire, despite the great devastation, did not surrender. The Hobbit folk, with their enduring spirit, began to unite with even greater strength. New alliances formed, and a new kind of hope began to emerge among the young. The Shire would not allow despair to take hold. The resilience and courage the hobbits had always shown in small matters became their greatest strength now in facing the plague. As the pandemic raged and the casualties mounted, the villages altered their ways. Those who remained healthy began to care for the community's well-being in more organized ways. Instead of festivals and feasts, they organized care for the sick. Hobbit healers, though few, worked tirelessly to discover ways to treat the illness, with some resources coming from outside the Shire, medicines from the elves, and remedies from men, who tried to help as best they could. The impact of the Great Plague was not only physical, but psychological and cultural as well. Long after the sickness began to wane, its consequences extended beyond the empty streets and abandoned homes. The hobbits who survived the plague had to grapple not only with the loss of relatives and friends, but with the weight of a collective mourning, something they had never experienced in their quiet, sheltered lives. Grief and suffering lingered in every corner of the Shire, in every field, and even in the hills where hobbit laughter was once heard during picnics and festivals. And when the plague finally ended, the Shire could not simply return to the way things were before. The villages that had been hit the hardest remained sparsely populated, and the survivors began to rebuild. But the mourning never fully lifted. The memories of the Great Plague became part of the identity of an entire generation of hobbits. The children who had grown up in an environment of peace now knew life's hardship and the fragility of existence. What most characterized this period of reconstruction was a change in the hobbits' view of life and death. Before the plague, hobbits looked upon death from a distance, as a rare event that came only from natural old age. But with the sudden death of so many young and middle-aged folk, their perception of mortality was fundamentally altered. There were no longer any guarantees that things would simply continue as they always had. Life in the Shire, once marked by a quiet, predictable rhythm, was now steeped in a reality that felt more mysterious and uncertain. By their very nature, the Hobbit folk preferred to avoid big problems and major changes. But the plague forced them to re-examine many of their customs. Many began to realize that blind faith in the Shire's permanence might have been a grave mistake, and some families, once very isolated and closed off, began to open up more, forming support networks, having learned the hardest way that community is one of the greatest strengths in the face of adversity. Yet this also cast a shadow over the future. The younger generation, which had witnessed death up close, began to harbor a greater fear of the unknown, while the older hobbits who survived the plague tried to rebuild their lives. A growing trend appeared among the youth to change the way things were done. Many old traditions began to be questioned, and the pride taken in hospitality and celebrations was now shaded by a need for new, more organized methods. The confidence in the future, which had always been a Hobbit trait, had been shaken, and this was reflected in how children were raised. In the years following the Great Plague, the Shire underwent an emotional recovery that was much slower than its physical one. The belief that peace and prosperity could be guaranteed solely through routine and tradition was no longer a certainty. A new generation of hobbits grew up aware of life's fragility, understanding that safety was more tenuous than they had ever thought. And though the fields began to flourish again, and the villages started to rebuild their homes, the memory of the Great Plague lived on in the stories told by the elders. Gradually, however, the newer generations moved further from the direct pain, and the cheerful, relaxed rhythm of festivals and feasts was restored, though in a more reserved manner, as if the laughter now carried an echo of caution. The Great Plague also affected how the hobbits related to the outside world. Before the pandemic, the Shire was a near isolated place, and the hobbits took pride in their ability to live without the interference of the outer world. But the plague brought home the truth that the Shire was not impervious to the great calamities that occurred in the lands beyond. The plague led some hobbits to begin questioning their policy of isolation, and they started to consider the necessity of greater interaction with the world beyond the Shire. Journeys became more common, and new connections were established with elves, men, and even dwarves. Though this change was modest, it represented a break from the Hobbit traditions that had always preferred quiet and stability. However, this interaction with the outside was not without its difficulties. Many hobbits still looked upon cultures outside the Shire with suspicion, and though acceptance slowly grew, the Shire never lost its fundamentally self-sufficient and independent nature. The ultimate result of the Great Plague was a transformation of the Shire, not only in terms of loss and reconstruction, but in mentality and behavior as well. The hobbits, resilient as they were, began to look upon the world and life with a more conscious gaze, aware that peace was precious, but also fragile. The cheerful spirit of the Shire, though it never fully disappeared, was now mixed with a healthy dose of caution, evident in the generations that grew up after the plague. As time passed, the Great Plague became a distant memory, but its legacy, both in physical and emotional scars, continued to influence the decisions and actions of the hobbits, leaving its mark on the Shire forever. The spirit of community, solidarity, and unity in the face of suffering were the greatest lessons the hobbits inherited from that dark era. The story of the orc invasion of the Shire, which occurred in the year 2747 of the Third Age, is a dark and pivotal event in Hobbit history. For though the Shire was a quiet, peaceful land, far from the great conflicts that destroyed other corners of Middle-earth, it was not entirely protected from the evil forces that lurked in the shadows, though the invasion was not on the scale of the vast battles happening abroad. It left deep scars on Hobbit history and culture. It all began with the growing threat of Sauron, who, in his later years of power in the south of Middle-earth, began sending hordes of orcs and other vile creatures to attack regions that had until then been considered safe. The orcs, ever thirsty for destruction and conquest, had discovered the Shire as an easy target, isolated and unprepared to face them. They were drawn by the Shire's symbolic wealth, its fertile fields, its peaceful lands, and especially its precious crops of pipeweed and stores of food, a well-kept secret of great value. For an army of hungry orcs, the promise of plunder and ruin was irresistible. The first warnings came in the form of small raids. In some parts of the Shire, groups of hobbits began to notice dark figures in the distance, moving in the nearby woods and fields. At first, many hobbits thought they were merely rumors or shadows born of anxiety. But it soon became clear that something more sinister was afoot. Towns like Hobbiton and Michel Delving began to hear stories of disappearances, of animals mysteriously killed, and even of small fields set ablaze. As the attacks grew more frequent, the truth became inescapable. Orcs were invading the Shire. In response, the leaders of the Shire, like the Thane and the Mayor, began to gather groups for defense. But this process was disorganized, for the hobbits were not accustomed to facing enemies of this kind. They were not trained warriors. They were farmers, craftsmen, traders, and above all, peaceful creatures. The very idea of war was utterly foreign to them. Families barricaded themselves in their homes, locking doors and windows, hoping the invaders would pass through the area without causing harm. But the orcs were not just a physical threat. The psychological terror they spread was immense. Their presence, with their screeches and their wanton destruction, shook the confidence of the hobbits, who had always lived in a safe, insulated society. For the first time, the Shire was no longer a sanctuary. The land that had always been a haven of peace was now steeped in fear and doubt. The hobbits' initial response was a series of small skirmishes. The Shire, with its scattered villages and small communities, was not suited for traditional battles. Yet many hobbits began to organize into makeshift resistance groups. They used their knowledge of the land to set ambushes against the orcs, attacks that were successful in some cases, but were sporadic and unable to halt the invaders' advance. Many hobbits began hiding in remote places, like the Tookland Hills, and in secret caves deep within the Shire, fleeing the imminent threat. However, it soon became clear that the danger was growing. These were no longer just small bands of orcs. This was a full-scale invasion. Their leader, a skilled and fierce commander, whose name has been lost to time, directed his followers in ever bolder attacks. They split into different groups, surrounding major villages like Hobbiton, Buckland, and Michel Delving, the very nerve centers of the Shire. The invasion was swift and devastating. The Hobbit's quiet life was abruptly shattered by the arrival of these marauders. As the orcs attacked the main villages and laid waste to the fields, many hobbits fled toward the hills, seeking refuge in the higher lands. The Shire, once a place of serenity, had transformed into a battlefield. The hobbits began to realize their peaceful existence was under an irreversible threat. The Shire was plunged into chaos. This was no longer a series of isolated raids. The invaders were advancing, burning crops, looting homes, and sowing terror among the hobbits. The most vulnerable villages, those on the borders of the Shire, fell first. Places like Rushy and Whitfurrows were destroyed before any real defensive plan could be made. Many hobbits, bewildered by the horror of war, fled in desperation deeper into the Shire, seeking safety in places less exposed. But unlike other folk in Middle-earth who had faced orcs throughout history, hobbits were not warriors. They had no armies, no forts, no weapons forged for battle. What could they possibly do against a merciless horde? The invasion of the Shire by orcs in the year 2747 of the Third Age was a grim and transformative event in Hobbit history. Although the Shire was a quiet, peaceful land, far from the great conflicts that ravaged other parts of Middle-earth, it was not entirely immune to the evil forces lurking in the shadows. This invasion, while not as vast as the great battles fought elsewhere, left deep scars on Hobbit history and culture. It all began with the growing threat of Sauron. In his final years of power in the south of Middle-earth, he began sending forth his hordes of orcs and other foul creatures to attack regions that had until then been considered safe. The orcs, always thirsty for destruction and conquest, had discovered the Shire as an easy, isolated, and unprepared target. They were drawn by the symbolic wealth of the land, its fertile fields, its peaceful pastures, and especially its precious crops of pipeweed and bountiful food. A well-kept secret, but one of great value. To an army of hungry orcs, the promise of plunder and ruin was too tempting to ignore. The first warnings came as small raids. In some areas of the Shire, folk began to notice dark shapes in the distance, moving between the nearby woods and fields. At first, many hobbits thought it was just rumor or shadows born of nervous thoughts. However, it soon became clear that something more sinister was afoot. Villages like Hobbiton and Meikle Delving began to hear tales of disappearances, of animals slain under strange circumstances, and even of some of the smaller crop stores being put to the torch. As the attacks increased, the reality became undeniable. The orcs were invading the Shire. In response, the region's leaders, like the mayor, began to muster defensive groups. Yet this effort was disorganized, for hobbits were not accustomed to facing such serious foes. They were not trained fighters. They were farmers, artisans, tradesfolk, and above all, creatures of peace. The very idea of fighting was completely foreign to them. Families hid in their homes, bolting the doors and shutting the windows, hoping the invaders would pass them by unnoticed. Yet the orcs represented more than just a physical threat. The psychological terror they sowed was immense. Their very presence, with their harsh cries and wanton destruction, chipped away at the confidence of the hobbits, who had always lived in a secure and sheltered society. For the first time, the Shire was no longer a safe haven. This land, which had always been synonymous with peace, was now filled with fear and uncertainty. the hobbits' initial response consisted of small, scattered skirmishes. The Shire, with its sprawling villages and tight-knit communities, was not a place suited for traditional warfare. Yet, many hobbits began to organize themselves into groups, forming makeshift bands of resistance. They used their deep knowledge of the land to set ambushes for the orcs. These tactics, while successful in some cases, were limited and could not halt the invaders' advance. Many hobbits took to hiding in remote places, like the Tookland Hills, or in secret caves deep within the countryside, away from the immediate threat. However, it soon became clear that the danger was escalating. These were no longer just small bands of orcs. This was a true invasion. Their leader, a cunning and cruel officer whose name has been lost to time, directed his followers in attacks that grew bolder. They split into different groups, encircling the main villages like Hobbiton, Buckland, and the town of Michel Delving itself, the vital hubs of the region. The invasion was swift and devastating. The peaceful life of the hobbits came to an abrupt halt because of the invaders' presence. As the orcs attacked the main villages and destroyed the fields, many hobbits fled toward the hills, searching for refuge in the higher lands. Their country, once a place of calm, had become a battlefield, and the hobbits began to realize their peaceful way of life was under an irreversible threat. The Shire was plunged into chaos. This orc invasion was not just a series of isolated attacks. The invaders were advancing, burning crops, looting homes, and sowing terror among the hobbits. The most vulnerable villages, those on the very borders of the land, fell first. Settlements like Rushy and Whitfurrows were destroyed before any real defensive plan could be made. Many hobbits, confused and horrified by the terror of war, fled inward, desperate to find places less exposed to danger. But unlike the other folk of Middle-earth, who had faced orcs throughout history, hobbits were not warriors. They had no armies, no forts, no weapons crafted for battle. So, what could they possibly do against a ruthless horde? Despite the panic, the hobbits showed an unexpected resilience. When they realized that simply running would not save them, they began to resist with whatever they had. And though they lacked the swords and shields of the armies of Gondor or Rohan, the hobbits knew every inch of their land, and they began to use that knowledge to their advantage. Small bands of resistance started to form in Tookland and in other regions of hills and woods. And it was in this moment that an unlikely hero emerged, Vandabaris Took, also known as Bullroarer. This was no ordinary hobbit. He was among the few remarkable for his uncommon height, nearly that of a regular man. It is said he possessed strength enough to ride a horse, a rare feat among hobbits. Along with his strength, Vandabaris possessed great courage, and when he saw his homeland threatened, he decided to act. As the orcs advanced toward Hobbiton and Michel Delving, Vandabaris Took gathered a sizable group of hobbits willing to make a stand. They were not skilled warriors, but they were excellent marksmen. Their practiced abilities with slings and small arrows, tools usually reserved for hunting game or friendly competition, were now being turned into makeshift weapons for the battle ahead. Preparations for an improvised battle against the orcs began. And so commenced the Battle of Greenfields, a historic event in Middle-earth, and one of the few records that documents hobbits fighting against a threat of such magnitude. The orcs advanced across the fields of the Shire, confident in their superiority, believing they would crush any resistance with ease. But they had not accounted for the cleverness of the hobbits. Vandoberes, Took and his makeshift warriors had prepared ambushes across the plains and woods, using ditches and natural hides to surprise the invaders. When the orcs least expected it, a rain of arrows and stones fell upon them from every direction, striking them down before they could even respond. The decisive moment came when Vandoberes Took himself led a direct charge against the orc chieftain. The leader of the horde was a massive orc, a terrifying warrior who had fought many battles in the north. But Vandoberes did not hesitate. In one swift and precise movement, he charged forward and struck a single, mighty blow that sent the orc leader's head flying through the air. It landed several yards away. The sight of their slain leader struck terror into the hearts of the remaining orcs. Without their commander, many began to falter and retreat. And here, the hobbits seized the initiative. With great resolve, these small warriors drove the orcs from the Shire. What had begun as a devastating invasion had transformed into one of the greatest victories in Hobbit history, proving that a determined people who know their land intimately can stand firm against a far stronger foe, even without vast armies or great weapons. This victory brought a new sense of identity to the Shire. For the first time, the hobbits understood that their home was not just a peaceful place, but a land worth defending. In honor of his deed, Vandoberes Took was celebrated as one of the Shire's greatest heroes. His courage was recorded in history and passed down through the generations of hobbits. It is said that after the battle, he simply returned to his quiet life, living in peace until the end of his days. But the scars of the invasion lingered for many long years. Some villages needed decades to fully recover from the damage. The threat of the orcs was never completely forgotten. And though the Shire returned to its peaceful routines, the hobbits now knew that the world beyond their borders was still a perilous place. This understanding shaped Hobbit culture in the centuries that followed, making them more cautious of outsiders and reinforcing their inclination toward isolation. The battle ended. The orcs were expelled from the Shire. The Hobbit folk had held their ground, despite having no military tradition, and triumphed over a much stronger enemy. But the price of victory was steep. The northern lands of the Shire were devastated. Many villages were burned, crops destroyed. The hobbits, accustomed to peace and comfort, now faced a harsh reality. Their Shire was no longer an impenetrable land. In the months following the Battle of Greenfields, the survivors began the slow process of rebuilding. Many hobbits had lost their homes. Some families were entirely wiped out by the attack. The green hills that once symbolized Hobbit prosperity now bore the marks of conflict. Scorched fields, remnants of weapons, and broken arrows scattered on the ground. Yet, the spirit of resilience among the hobbits shone once more. They worked together, rebuilding their villages and replanting their fields with tireless dedication. The Shire returned to prosperity, but something had fundamentally changed. Its innocence was lost. For the first time in their history, the hobbits understood that the outside world was not just a distant, unknown place. but a real and present threat that could reach their very doorsteps. The victory over the orcs left a profound mark on Hobbit culture. Before the invasion, hobbits rarely concerned themselves with events beyond their borders. But after the battle, a quiet unease spread among them. Tales of the war were passed down from generation to generation, and many hobbits began to view the outside world with a sense of suspicion. This helped cement one of their most defining traits: their desire for solitude. They came to believe that the less they engaged with the outside world, the less chance there was of facing a similar threat again. This thinking solidified into a philosophy that would shape the Shire for centuries to come. The event also forged new traditions and memories within Hobbit society. The name of Vandoberas Took, the Bull Roarer, was enshrined as one of the Shire's greatest heroes. Stories of his courage were told everywhere, and his legendary feat of beheading the orc chieftain became one of the most famous tales among hobbits. In the invasion's wake, certain measures were taken to prevent anything similar from happening again. The Shire's leaders realized they needed some form of organization to maintain the region's security. And so, the Shire Watch was born. A group of hobbits tasked with watching the roads, guarding the borders, and ensuring no unwelcome presence went unnoticed. Though the watch was made up of peaceful hobbits, they began to carry small clubs and slings, symbols of the resistance they had shown during the battle. The watch, however, was not an army, and it never intended to become one. Its goal was simply to avoid unpleasant surprises and to help ensure the Shire remained protected. Yet, the scars of the invasion were felt for many long years. Some villages needed decades to fully recover from the damage. The threat of the orcs was never entirely forgotten. And though the Shire returned to its peaceful routines, the hobbits now carried the knowledge that the world around them was still a dangerous place. This awareness shaped Hobbit culture in the following centuries, making them warier of outsiders and reinforcing their inclination toward isolation. The battle had ended, and the orcs were driven from the Shire. The Hobbit folk had held their ground, despite having no martial traditions, and triumphed over a much stronger enemy. But the price of victory was steep. The northern lands of the Shire lay in ruins. Many villages were burned, crops destroyed. The hobbits, a people accustomed to peace and comfort, were faced with a harsh new reality. Their Shire was no longer an impenetrable land. In the months following the Battle of Greenfields, the survivors began the slow process of rebuilding. Many hobbits had lost their homes. Some families were completely wiped out by the attack. The green hills that once symbolized Hobbit prosperity now bore the marks of conflict. Scorched fields, the remnants of weapons, and broken arrows scattered on the ground. Yet, the spirit of resilience among the hobbits shone once again. They worked together, rebuilding their villages and replanting their fields with tireless dedication. The Shire returned to prosperity, but something fundamental had changed. Its innocence was lost. For the first time in their history, the hobbits understood that the outside world was not just a distant, unknown place. It was a real and present threat that could reach their very doorsteps. The victory over the orcs left a profound mark on Hobbit culture. Before the invasion, hobbits rarely concerned themselves with events beyond their borders. But after the battle, a quiet unease settled among them. Tales of the war were passed down from generation to generation, and many hobbits began to view the outside world with a deep and abiding suspicion. This reinforced one of the most distinctive traits of hobbits: their desire for solitude. They understood that the less contact they had with the outside world, the smaller the chance of facing a similar threat again. This idea hardened into a philosophy that would shape the Shire for the centuries to follow. The event also created new traditions and memories within Hobbit society. The name of Vandoberis Took was enshrined as one of the Shire's greatest heroes. Stories of his courage were told everywhere, and his legendary deed, the beheading of the Orc chieftain, became one of the most famous tales among hobbits. After the invasion, certain measures were taken to prevent anything similar from happening again. The Shire's leaders realized they needed some form of organization to maintain the region's security. And so, the Shire Watch was born. This was a group of hobbits tasked with watching the roads, guarding the borders, and making sure no unwanted presences slipped through. Although the Watch was made up of peaceful hobbits, they began to carry small clubs and slings, symbols of the resistance they had shown during the battle. However, the Watch was not an army, and it had no intention of becoming one. Its goal was simply to avoid unpleasant surprises and to help ensure the Shire remained protected. The event also marked the beginning of greater attention being paid to the roads and the movement of travelers into and out of the Shire. Before this, hobbits hadn't paid much mind to outsiders, but now they became more cautious. Over time, this wariness grew, making the hobbit folk more reserved and inward-looking. Interestingly, the hobbits' victory did more than just strengthen their own community. It also helped weaken the orcs in the wider region. After the death of their chieftain and their defeat in the battle, the bands of orcs that had invaded the Shire never truly recovered. Many of them fled back to the Misty Mountains, while the remaining stragglers were hunted down and finished off by the patrols of elves and men in the north. Although the threat of orcs was never fully erased from Middle-earth, the Shire remained, for centuries afterward, relatively safe. The invasion became a permanent reminder of the danger that lurked beyond its borders. But it also strengthened the belief that the peace and simplicity of Hobbit life were things worth protecting at any cost. After the battle and the rebuilding of the Shire, Vandoberis Took did not seek fame or recognition. Unlike the kings and great warriors of Middle-earth, whose victories were immortalized in grand songs, Vandoberis simply returned to the quiet life of a hobbit. He lived many long years and died peacefully, surrounded by family and a community that never forgot his bravery. Yet even after his passing, his name lived on. Generations later, Bilbo Baggins, and later Frodo Baggins, would still recall the stories of Vandoberis and the Battle of Greenfields. The spirit of resistance and courage in hobbits, even in their darkest hours, can be traced back to that pivotal moment in the Shire's history. The Orc invasion was the greatest challenge the hobbits had faced up to that point, and their victory left a permanent mark on the Shire's culture, its policies, and its very identity. Now we can move to the final part of our tale, where we see how the Shire settled and remained secure in the years that followed. preserving its peace right up until the events of the War of the Ring. The history of the Shire is proof that even the most peaceful of peoples can leave a profound mark on the fate of the world. From their humble origins as wanderers without a fixed home, to the founding of the Shire, and then the challenges they faced, like the Great Plague and the Orc invasion. Each event shaped the identity of this unique folk. The Shire was not a great kingdom. It possessed no powerful armies or legendary wizards. It endured not by the strength of arms, but by the strength of community, resilience, and a deep-seated desire to preserve a simple and peaceful life. The hobbits never sought glory or conquest, and perhaps that is precisely why they managed to maintain a unique sanctuary in a world so full of war and shadow. After centuries of challenges and changes, the hobbits grew more reserved. The stories of the battle against the orcs, the devastating plague, and the hard times were passed from generation to generation, though with time, many of these events faded into legend. The Shire remained an isolated and sheltered place, where the worries of the outside world rarely found room to grow. But this choice of isolation was not a weakness. On the contrary, the hobbits learned that their true strength lay not in war, but in the quiet endurance of their culture, and in their deep love for the land they called home. And as the events of the War of the Ring began to take shape, the Shire was still a quiet paradise, unaware that the fate of all Middle-earth would soon rest on the shoulders of one small hobbit. The sturdy spirit of its people, and the legacy of heroes like Vandoberus took, proved that even the smallest can rise to meet the greatest of challenges. Bilbo Baggins, Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin all carried in their hearts the strength of a people who had survived plagues, invasions, and centuries of hardship. And though most hobbits remained unaware of the great wars of the outside world, their spirit was present in those few who one day carried the courage and simplicity far beyond the Shire's borders. The Shire represented something far greater than just a homeland for hobbits. It was a symbol of what is truly worth protecting: the beauty of a simple life, friendship, a love for the earth, and the desire to live in peace. Even in the face of the greatest threats, the story of the Shire teaches us that true strength comes not from swords or power alone, but from the heart, and from the resilience of a people determined to protect what they love. And so the Shire continued, quiet and prosperous, while the world changed around it. But its legacy was never forgotten. For as long as there are those who appreciate a good meal, a warm home, and the peace of a beautiful garden, the story of the hobbits and the Shire will remain alive. Now tell me, adventurer, if you had to choose between the destiny of great kings and warriors, or the quiet life of a hobbit in the Shire, which would you pick? If you enjoyed this tale and want to explore more of the world of hobbits and Middle-earth, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your presence makes all the difference. Now, relax. Let your imagination wander. And until the next adventure,